This is TWiT.
The other big story, and this one I feel like we got to get the internet's lawyer on for this or something, but the EU has now approved two big regulations that will very much impact Google. The Digital Services Act
the Digital Markets.
The Digital Markets Act. There are two of them, DMA and DSA. The DMA is more about competition, and I think that's the one that's going to probably more affect Google, but Google will be affected by both of them. Says that digital service, quote, gatekeepers who break the laws for promoting competition. The law says these companies must obtain explicit consent to target ads based on personal data. That's, of course, completely undermines Google's model.
It undermines most media companies. It undermines most of the entire media business now.
It'll be interesting to see what Google does about this. It requires interoperability between messaging platforms. Of course, that's probably targeted at Apple's iMessage, which is very much a closed.
Well, also targeted at
Android
Facebook's, at Meta's.
Facebook,
at Meta's
WhatsApp,
too. Yeah. WhatsApp, yeah.
Although it's good for Meta. If WhatsApp can interoperate with Apple's messages, that's very good for Meta. Really, Apple has this monopoly on iPhones with messaging.
Highly complex.
Yeah. It also says that large platforms must let, and this affects Apple more than Google, because you can choose browsers on Android, let users select a browser, search engine, and personal voice assistant of their choice. Although Google is very much involved because Google pays, it is estimated, between $10 and $12 billion a year to Apple to be the default search engine on Safari on iPhones. Apple does not let any other browser use its own engine. You have to use WebKit, the Safari engine, on iPhone. So really, Safari has a monopoly on iPhone with everything but the UI. And you can change search engines, but as you know, the default is going to be always the dominant search engine. So Google pays a lot for that.
I think Apple's been quietly building a search engine too. Isn't that I mean, if I look at my logs on my server, I'll sometimes see massive queries from Apple addresses for various pages of sites I operate. So like so many things at Apple, they've got things in the lab that they roll out when they're convenient. And I think they've probably got enough storage and data capacity to run a search engine if they had to for their customers.
So you can have a robots.txt that will allow Apple visiting or block it. That's interesting. I haven't looked at my logs in a while. I don't
know. I sometimes see I have to. I have relatively low end server, virtual servers. So occasionally people get out overzealous, and I have to put in some blocks. And I have software that's like, "Hey, Apple just requested 50,000 pages." And I'm like, "Oh, they probably to not be doing that."
I had no idea they were spidering. That's very interesting.
Well, did you know about? I didn't know about this. Has been around for a while. I didn't know about Common Crawl.
I do not know about Common Crawl. What is that?
CommonCrawl.org is an open crawl of the web. I'm not saying Apple's going to use that.
Anybody can access it.
But anybody can access it.
Oh, interesting.
Isn't this really interesting?
Yeah.
This is, because I've been playing a lot with GPT-3 and writing about Lambda and all of that. This is the kind of stuff you use as the...
for your data set.
The data set, right. Thank you. And so I'm not saying that's that, but crawling used to be this high art and difficult barrier to go over for functionality of other applications.
I think it's
such a big deal.
I think it still is. I think Google.
I think so. In general, for the level of quality you get.
Yeah,
yes,
there really are only two search engines, Google and Bing. Everything else is derivative. I mean, you can go to DuckDuckGo. They say
Ant laughs. You said Bing and Ant just guffaws.
It's 1.5.
All right.
Yeah, I always laugh when I hear Bing. He just came off Windows Weekly, so he has to suppress his natural view of the world.
Don't you have Jonathan Mann's Bing song just queued up to go at any time?
I should.
Come on.
Right.
One of his song of days.
Bing, Bing, Bing goes the internet.
It would be meaningless if it weren't the default search engine in Microsoft Windows. And I think because, again, the tyranny of the default, people don't change things. Bing is still pretty important. It's not. I mean, you know what? Google does not want Bing not to succeed because that's the same reason Microsoft wanted
antitrust
Apple around.
stuff.
Yeah. Google can credibly say, "Oh, we're not a monopoly, Your Honor."
Okay.
Even in the EU, where they are much more dominant, Google's only about 80% of the browser market. I think it's only 60% in the U.S.
I don't know if it's exactly a technical question. I mean, we've all been around the block a few million times, and I feel like it shouldn't be that hard to make a search engine. And I don't mean that in like this facile, well, there's not that many, it's not that big a deal, but the internet kind of stabilized, right? There's a lot of storage. Storage is relatively cheap. Computational power is relatively cheap. There are companies out there with piles of money who don't know what to do to reinvest it. I actually don't understand why Apple is a likely candidate, as I say, but it's not an intractable problem the way it was when you literally couldn't buy enough servers to stick in racks fast enough to keep up with the growth of the net. And a lot of sites are programmatically driven now. They're database driven. So when you go to Amazon, it's a whole different matter now than when it seemed like 1 million static pages. It's 500 million database driven pages. So I don't know. I feel like there's something missing. Is there not enough money to extract?
You got $1 billion a year, Glenn, because that's the estimate of how much it would cost.
We could ask Elon Musk. I think he's probably.
So there are some.
You're also dealing with spam. You're dealing with spam.
There are big companies that could do this.
You're trying to intuit the content, the topicality of the content. It's not just
all true.
There's more.
But don't you think there's enough computer scientists have been minted, enough AI work? I mean, is there enough work of all kinds out there?
It's just expensive.
Yeah, but
think
expensive at the scale of where you have trillion-dollar companies, and Microsoft's engine is not great, even though the company's been executing a lot of other ways very well. Bing is not great, and DuckDuckGo is kind of a weird. The fact that it's emerged so much because of privacy issues in a world in which there are trillion-dollar companies that could throw $1 billion a year at a problem if they felt like there was a return. I don't know. I feel like I'm missing a piece here.
Another way to put it, Glenn, is what's the next generation of search?
Oh yeah.
So I think what you're talking about is search as we know it, like phones, has been static for a while.
You're totally right.
And we're old enough to, having been around the block a few times, as you say, we're old enough to remember the advance that Google was on Fast and on Alta Vista at all. Right, because of its, but what was different about it was, of course, PageRank was about understanding the world differently, and I think that there are frontiers to be had when you get to things like quality or relevance or authority that are much harder problems to attack. Which I would hope that Google would be the one attacking, because I don't think they're really a company set in their ways. But is search done? Is kind of what you're saying, or are there new frontiers?
No, that's where you get into Siri and voice assistants, where maybe the issue is, it's nice. I still laugh because I've got an iPhone. I'm a very Apple committed person, and I'm trying to get Siri. We're like sitting around watching TV, the family, and somebody asks a question. I'm like, oh, I'll ask Siri, and Siri gives me a lousy answer. I'm like, all right, I'm going to launch my Google app, because I know when I use voice recognition on Google, its response will be even better than if I typed it in on the Google app and I get the answer I want. So that's kind of it. Is Google feels more advanced in that sort of query, even though Apple, I know, really, there's a lot of companies that would love to be the master of that new domain, right?
Well, you're saying there's a lot of companies that would love to be the master. Who are some of those companies? Because there's only going to be a handful of them that can afford it, number one. Yeah. And number two, is it a big enough return on their investment? Google is making a ton of money. Why would someone leave Google if there's a new search engine that's out there?
I think that's one of the reasons there's all that conversations about what's next, because nobody wants to go head to head against Google. It's not merely the $1 billion a year you'd have to spend to spider the net. There's also, Google's been doing it for 20 years, so they have a huge amount of track record, historic.
The queries are your value. Our queries are the value.
Yeah. So I think probably, and by the way, to get back to our original subject, with the EU getting involved, with the EU and getting involved in regulating all of this, you might think twice before saying, I'm going to plunge $1 billion a year plus whatever software development costs are to do this. Brave says they're doing a search engine. DuckDuckGo says they're doing a search engine. But none of these attempts, I think, really compete with Bing and Google. By the way, just so you know, I looked it up. Google in the U.S. is 70% market share.
Oh.
Bing is 13.3%. Maybe this must be global, because Baidu is in there at 12.5%. And Yahoo still around at 2%. I don't know if that's even fair to say, because Yahoo's based on Bing. But Google has held pretty steady for desktop. Now, That might be a little bit different if you look at mobile. In fact, we can do that, I think. Device type. Change that.
Google is not stressing.
Mobile. Wow. Google's even more dominant in mobile, almost 95%. Okay, never mind.
Man.
Never mind.
All right, I guess the question, I mean, it's just kind of one of those things about like, why does time travel exist? Well, if it did, we probably would have already seen time travelers. So maybe you can't have another good search engine, one that competes with Google, because it would have happened by now before they reached
Because you'd
their
have to
absolute
kill your
dominance.
grandfather. That's why.
Yeah, it's the Google grandfather paradox, sure. Don't Google your grandfather.
No, I've asked that question. It's a really good question, Glenn, is why isn't there competition in what is clearly a very profitable... If Google can afford to give Apple $12 billion a year just so that it's the default search engine on iPhones, there's a lot of money.
A lot of cash.
There's a lot of cash flow being driven by a browser. Clearly, though, I think it's fair to say, and Google's been in trouble for a while, favoring its own properties. And that's one of the things that DMA is particularly there to fight against. This is, of course, in this way it works in the EU because of complaints from, remember Google Shopping? People complain about that. Yelp complains about Google reviews, that kind of thing. So it comes from competitors, but it is now official, the Digital Markets Act. The Digital Services Act only affects platforms with 45 million monthly active users. So it's pretty much aimed at Facebook and Twitter, I guess. Twitter might just skate in under that. If Google had Google Plus, maybe, I don't know. So the DSA puts responsibility on platforms to police and take down illegal content. The problem is, what is illegal speech? And this is what of course, Elon Musk has been trying to figure out